Hello everyone. I'll be presenting SemperFi, an anti-spoofing GPS receiver specifically built for UAVs. So as you know, GPS, or Global Positioning System, is the de facto system that provides position and timing information anywhere on Earth. It has become one of the most critical systems that can provide safety and security critical applications in almost every industry. So 14 out of 16 critical industries identified by the Department of Homeland Security rely on GPS for their daily operations. Even autonomous vehicles, GPS is a critical component that enables the autonomous capability. And so these include the transportation sector, energy sectors, and even emergency services. And GPS lacks any kind of authentication, and hence by transmitting fake GPS signals, an attacker can spoof a GPS receiver to any arbitrary location in the world. Researchers have reportedly demonstrated vulnerabilities in GPS. They have also shown that it's possible to alter the course of yachts, cars, and even unmanned aerial vehicles by simply spoofing GPS signals. Moreover, GPS exploits have also been observed in the wild. So as recently as this month, when a bunch of airliners have reported experiencing GPS interference amidst the ongoing Ukraine-Russia crisis. So several countermeasures have been proposed to protect against these attacks, but these techniques either require a complete overhaul of the GPS ecosystem, like the cryptographic measurements, or they are limited to simple attack detection. So in this case, the main challenge is not just attack detection, but identification of adversarial signals and mitigation. This is especially difficult when it comes to seamless takeover attacks. And there are no current countermeasures that can detect and mitigate spoofing attacks at the same time, and especially in case of UAVs, which have very tight power and weight constraints. So to overcome these shortcomings, we present SemperFi, a spoofer eliminating GPS receiver, which is capable of autonomous recovery and is capable of providing continuous output of legitimate location, even in case of a spoofing attack. So SemperFi leverages inertial sensors and extended Kalman filter-based sensor fusion algorithm that is already built into modern UAVs. It supports active spoofing identification and verification by using these sensors. So the GNSS SDR implementation of SemperFi is also capable of real-time operations. With this, it can provide legitimate location recovery in under half a second, and with post-recovery location accuracy with up to 20 meters, as compared to spoofed location, which is already hundreds or even thousands of meters away. To achieve these, we have two components. So these are the adversarial peak identifier, which is responsible for attack detection and signal identification, and the legitimate signal retriever, which is used for parameter estimation, which is required to perform successive interference cancellation for the recovery of signals. So modern UAVs typically implement an extended Kalman filter-based sensor fusion algorithm that provides state estimates, which are vital in maintaining control over the UAV. The onboard sensor fusion algorithm fuses inertial measurements and GPS measurements. So in most GPS attacks, there is a discrepancy between the inertial measurements and GPS measurements. And as a result, the state estimation errors build up and will cause an increase in the variance. And as a result, the flight controller will trigger an EK failsafe because of unreliable measurements. Now an attacker can spoof by controlling the legitimate locations, controlling the spoofed locations, and can stay within the threshold and avoid detection. Now, so in this case, we have auxiliary peak detection, which looks for multiple correlation peaks. A GPS receiver uses correlation to identify or search for visible satellite signals. Each signal is represented by the code delay and the Doppler from the correlation matrix. And if the correlation matrix sees multiple peaks, it means that the receiver is seeing multiple signals from the same satellite. And in most cases, it is an indication of a spoofing attack. But the downside here is that it only detects an attack, and the receiver, in this case, cannot really identify which of these two peaks is the adversarial peak. So for this, we introduce an active spoofing identification. So as explained earlier, EKF checks can be fooled by an attacker who has a controlled spoofing mechanism. However, such an attack can still be detected through presence of multiple peaks. So when a receiver sees multiple peaks, the receiver will automatically track the stronger signal. And since the attack is controlled, the variance does not rise above the error limit. So in this case, we introduce this active identification maneuver. Here, SemperFi instructs the UAV to perform a maneuver which is random and consists of rapid acceleration and deacceleration. So since the motion or the movement of the maneuver is unknown to the attacker, the GPS signals generated by the attacker do not reflect this motion, and hence it causes a discrepancy between the inertial measurements and the GPS measurements. And once the flight controller runs the EKF check, this variance increases and triggers the failsafe. So as you can see, once the failsafe has been triggered, it is an indication that the receiver is tracking adversarial signals. And through this, SemperFi identifies the adversarial peak and can now proceed with recovery. So it's important to note that this maneuver is essential or is required only if EKF checks are unable to detect any attack. So if EKF checks can detect and the failsafe is triggered, this maneuver won't be necessary, as SemperFi knows what signal to attenuate. So once the adversarial signals are detected and identified, SemperFi activates the legitimate signal retriever. So first, it determines the target signal to attenuate. And as explained, the peak or the signal is identified by the code delay and the respective Doppler. So to generate the recovery signal, SemperFi needs to estimate the code delay, the Doppler, and the amplitude of the adversarial signal. So for this, we use a two-step acquisition process, which gives us an accurate estimate of the code delay and Doppler. And for amplitude, we use the peak metric or the correlation coefficient of this peak. So basically, this value. You can refer to the paper for a detailed explanation of how this amplitude is derived. So once the parameters are estimated, SemperFi generates a replica of the adversarial signal, which is then subtracted from the received signal to get a coarse legitimate signal. So since the adversarial signal is generated using parameters that are estimated, SemperFi may have to perform this recovery multiple times in order to get a complete recovery. And once recovery succeeds, the information for this legitimate signal is passed on, and the GPS receiver uses this information to further calculate the PVT solution, and which will be the legitimate location of the UAV. So various components and functions that provide this functionality are implemented as follows. First, the EKF checks are, as I mentioned, are already implemented in modern UAVs. So specifically, Ardocopter and PX4, they already have this check. The maneuver is also a part of this software, and for this we specifically use the ground control station. It essentially issues a command to the UAV which instructs it to fly in a certain direction for a certain time and at a certain speed. So this speed manipulation results in a specific rapid acceleration and deceleration. Next, the auxiliary peak detection and all the components of legitimate signal retriever are implemented as part of the GPS receiver. And in our work, we use GNSS SDR and open source software-defined receiver. So we specifically implement these in the acquisition block of the receiver. So for security and performance evaluation, we have a setup which uses an open source GPS signal simulator and USRPs for transmission and reception. We also have a live GPS antenna, which we can use to introduce live over-the-air signals in our spoofing traces. So with this, we are able to generate multiple attack scenarios with varying peak separation and power advantages. So we also have a real drone, which is a Holybro S500. It's a quadcopter, which uses the Pixar controller and runs the latest Ardicopter firmware. So we use it specifically to evaluate the identification maneuver. With this, we also have a software in the loop setup, which uses a robotic software called Gazebo. So the security guarantees depend on the ability to identify the adversarial signal. So for this, we focus on the time required by the UAV to trigger the failsafe. So ultimately, it comes down to the effectiveness of the maneuver. So since the attacker is unaware of the exact maneuver, the attacker can either guess the maneuver by going through or randomly picking values from a finite set of possible acceleration values that a drone is capable of, or the attacker can track the UAV in real time and generate signals accordingly. So if the attacker decides to guess the maneuver, then the factors that determine this time to trigger are IMU sensor resolution and maneuverability of the UAV. In this plot, we have the sensor resolution as the x-axis and maneuverability of the UAV as y-axis. So it's defined in terms of the maximum instantaneous jerk that the UAV is capable of. And as you can see, a highly maneuverable drone with a very high resolution sensor can trigger the EKF error well under 10 seconds. So specifically, if the attacker decides to track the UAV in real time and generate signals, then the factor that affects is the lag in tracking the UAV, generating the signal, and transmission. So this value is going to be different for different configurations of UAV based on its maneuverability, the sensor resolution, and not just the IMU sensor, but the GPS sensor and its update rate as well. So we further evaluated the time to trigger in 3 specific scenarios. In the first scenario, we have a static non-adaptive signal spoofing attack where the UAV is stationary and the attacker also transmits a static signal with the intention of hovering the drone. In the second scenario, the UAV is stationary and the attacker transmits a signal with the intention of moving the UAV to some arbitrary location. Here, the attacker is tracking the drone and is manipulating signals based on its drifts and motion. And in the third scenario, the UAV is moving from point A to point B, which it is already in motion, and the attacker performs an adaptive GPS takeover, just like in the second scenario. And in this case, with the identification maneuver, it took about 18 seconds to trigger the error. Now, let's take a look at how this identification maneuver looks like. So here, the spoofer starts, and which is evident in a high rise in the position variance. But since the attack is controlled, the position variance and the velocity variance is not enough to trigger the failsafe. So roughly about 40 seconds later, the auxiliary peak detection kicks in, detects a peak, and instructs the UAV to perform the maneuver. Here, with the rapid changes in velocity, the maneuver is seen, and after about 18 seconds, the EKF error failsafe is triggered and moves on to the recovery phase. So along with security, we also evaluate the performance of the SemperFi in terms of the location recovery. So the first is the effect of peak separation, or what's the synchronization between the attacker and the legitimate signal. So generally, closer the peaks, the harder it gets for the receiver to attenuate these signals. And similarly, with higher power advantage, the symbol constellations are distorted, and hence recovery gets difficult. But we have pseudo-range rectifier, which corrects for a signal's time of arrival information to still recover the legitimate location. And finally, we have a performance evaluation in terms of time that is required to perform one iteration of cancellation. We specifically perform this test on multiple platforms, including 2 embedded platforms, which are popular in terms of using as flight controllers. So these are Jetson Nano and Xavier. So in conclusion, SemperFi is a single antenna receiver that provides uninterrupted legitimate location even in case of an adversarial setting. It includes an active identification mechanism to detect and identify adversarial signals even in a seamless takeover attack. And there is a GNSS SDR implementation that can interface with multiple RF front ends and is capable of real-time operations. So SemperFi is implemented and evaluated on popular embedded platforms, which often work as flight controllers. And ultimately, we open the implementation to the community for further research and development. Thank you.